Miami, 2023. The climate-controlled vault smells wrong. Not the usual sterile blend of disinfectant and air conditioning that Walter Jenkins has come to expect over 25 years of cleaning sterling models. Today, beneath the artificial cold, there's something else. Something organic and old, like decay wrapped in perfume. Mr. Arthur Sterling, the legendary founder who built an empire on perfect faces and controlled dreams, died 3 days ago. Now Walter, at 80 years old, holds the only key to Sterling's private atelier, a locked room he's cleaned weekly for a quarter century but never truly examined. The agency is being liquidated. Everything must go, including her. The mannequin stands in the center of the vault, impossibly lifelike, draped in a black evening gown that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Willow Hayes. The name still carries weight in certain circles, whispered like a ghost story. A cautionary tale about a 17-year-old girl who threw away stardom for a cult. Walter has always hated this figure, the way its eyes seem to follow him, the unnatural weight when he moves it for cleaning. The faint chemical smell, Sterling insisted, was for preserving rare tropical wood displays. But today, lifting it to move it to storage, Walter's aging grip falters. The figure crashes to the concrete floor with a sound that echoes like a gunshot, and that's when he sees it. A small, faded butterfly tattoo on the small of its back. A tattoo he knows Willow was planning to get in secret. A tattoo Sterling had explicitly forbidden. Walter's hands begin to shake as 25 years of carefully maintained denial shatters in an instant. This isn't a mannequin. This is Willow Hayes. And she's been here the entire time. The year 1998 burned with the feverish energy of an industry addicted to youth. In Miami, where the sun bleached everything to brightness and money moved like the tides, that energy found its temple in Sterling models. The agency occupied the top 3 floors of a pristine glass tower in Brickell, a vertical palace of marble and mirrors where beauty was both worshipped and weaponized. The view from the penthouse office stretched across Biscayne Bay to the Atlantic beyond. But most people who entered that space never looked at the ocean. They were too busy watching Mr. Arthur Sterling. Sterling was 63 in 1998, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of cultivated elegance that suggested European aristocracy. Though he'd been born in Newark, he moved through his domain like a curator in a museum of living art, assessing, adjusting, perfecting. His reputation in the industry was biblical. He didn't discover models, people said. He created them. Raw material walked through his doors. Icons walked out. His eye was infallible. His standards were absolute. His control was total. The agency hummed with controlled chaos. Phones rang constantly in the booking department. Photographers shouted over music in the top-floor studio. Makeup artists and stylists moved through the hallways like surgical teams, always urgent, always precise. Models, some barely old enough to drive, waited in the glass-walled reception area, their portfolios clutched like religious texts, hoping for a chance to audition for Sterling's attention. Most would be dismissed with a glance. A rare few would be chosen. And of those, perhaps 1 in 100 would become what Sterling called a true creation. Moving through this glittering machinery, invisible as furniture, was Mr. Walter Jenkins. Walter had started at Sterling Models in 1973, back when the agency operated out of a converted warehouse in Little Havana and Miami was still finding its identity as an international city. He was 43 then, a quiet man who'd spent his youth in maintenance work at hotels along the beach, watching the wealthy come and go like weather patterns. The job at Sterling's had been steady, the pay fair, the work undemanding. He cleaned. He maintained. He kept the stage pristine for whatever drama was unfolding under the lights. By 1998, Walter was 68, gray-haired and wire-thin, his uniform always pressed, his manner always professional. He knew every corner of the agency's 3 floors. He knew which bathroom faucet leaked. He knew which floorboards creaked. He knew where the photographers hid their expensive equipment to avoid sharing. He knew which models snuck cigarettes in the stairwell. which agents skimmed from their clients' checks, which executives had affairs in the storage rooms after hours. He saw everything. He said nothing. That was his job. But Walter also saw the things others missed, the trembling hands of girls who smiled for the cameras, the tears quickly wiped away in empty hallways, the way Sterling's praise could lift someone to euphoria, and his criticism could crush them to powder. The unspoken rules. Never question Sterling's vision. Never refuse a shoot. Never, ever show weakness. The agency was a machine for manufacturing dreams, and like all machines, it had casualties. In the summer of 1998, Walter watched a new face arrive. She was different from the usual parade of hopefuls. She moved differently, carried herself with a kind of quiet defiance that reminded Walter of a wild animal that hadn't yet learned to fear humans. Her name was Willow Hayes. She was 17 years old, legally emancipated, with paperwork that said she'd graduated early from a high school in rural Georgia. She had the kind of face that photographers called transformative, strong bone structure, unusual features, eyes that could project vulnerability or strength depending on the light. But it was something else that caught Sterling's attention. She had presence, an authenticity that couldn't be taught or faked. Sterling saw it immediately. Within a week of her arrival, he'd terminated her contract with the junior booker who'd brought her in and taken over her management personally. This was rare. Sterling only did this for the models he considered his true masterpieces. Willow Hayes, he announced to his senior staff, would be Sterling Model's next major international launch. Walter first spoke to Willow on a Tuesday evening in late June. He was emptying trash bins on the studio floor, moving quietly as always, when he found her sitting alone in a darkened hallway, still in her makeup from a test shoot, staring at her hands. "You all right, miss?" Walter asked, his voice gentle. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten other people existed. "I'm fine. Just tired. Long day? Every day is long here." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Sterling wants me to do 6 more test shoots this week. Different looks, different photographers. He wants to find my true essence, he says." Walter nodded. He'd heard Sterling use that phrase before. It usually meant he was trying to break down whoever he was working with, strip away their defenses until they became whatever he wanted them to be. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Walter said quietly. Willow laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That's not how this works. You know that. I know Mr. Sterling likes control. But I also know you've got a choice." She studied him for a long moment. This old janitor, who'd bothered to stop and talk to her like a person rather than a product. "What's your name?" "Walter. Walter Jenkins. I'm Willow. But I guess you already knew that." She stood, smoothing her dress. "Thank you, Walter, for stopping. You take care of yourself, Miss Hayes." "I'll try." But as Walter watched her walk away down that corridor, heels clicking on marble, he felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. He'd seen this pattern before. Sterling had found his new obsession, and obsessions, in Sterling's world, never ended well. Over the following weeks, Walter watched Sterling's focus on Willow intensify. Private coaching sessions that stretched for hours, wardrobe consultations where Sterling personally selected every piece she would wear, both professionally and privately, dietary restrictions, exercise regimens. Even her social life was carefully monitored and managed. Sterling was sculpting her, reshaping her into his vision of perfection, and Willow, for her part, seemed to oscillate between gratitude and growing unease. She understood the opportunity Sterling represented. He could make her career, open doors that would otherwise remain locked forever. But Walter saw the cost in her eyes, the way her smile became more fixed, more practiced, less real. She was disappearing into whatever Sterling was creating. One evening in early September, Walter was cleaning Sterling's private atelier, a climate-controlled room on the penthouse level where Sterling kept his most precious acquisitions: vintage photographs, designer sketches, memorabilia from legendary shoots. It was here that Sterling spent his private hours, surrounded by the history of beauty he'd helped create. Willow appeared in the doorway, unexpected. She wasn't supposed to be on the penthouse level after hours. "Walter? Can I talk to you?" He straightened, concerned. "Of course. Miss Hayes. What's wrong?" She stepped inside, glancing nervously down the hallway. "I'm going to get a tattoo, a small butterfly, right here." She touched the small of her back. "It's for my mother. She loved butterflies before she died." Walter felt the danger immediately. "Does Mr. Sterling know?" "No. No tattoos, no piercings, nothing that might affect how I photograph." Her jaw set stubbornly. "But this isn't about photography. This is about me. About remembering where I came from. Miss Hayes, I know it's risky, but I'm doing it anyway. This Saturday, I wanted to tell someone, in case." She didn't finish the sentence. Walter wanted to warn her. Wanted to tell her that Sterling's control was absolute, that defying him would have consequences, but he also saw the desperation in her eyes. The need to claim some small piece of herself in a world that was systematically erasing her. "You be careful," was all he said. She smiled, genuine this time. "I will. Thank you, Walter, for listening." That was the last real conversation Walter Jenkins had with Willow Hayes. 3 days later, on a humid Saturday morning, Willow was supposed to attend a preliminary meeting with French Vogue's creative director, who was in Miami specifically to meet Sterling's newest discovery. It was the meeting that would launch her international career, the gateway to Paris, Milan, London, everything Sterling had been building toward. Willow Hayes never showed up, and by Monday morning, Mr. Arthur Sterling was standing in front of television cameras, telling the world exactly what had happened to his missing star. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to this investigation. Stories like Willow's, stories of young people crushed by powerful industries, stories hidden behind glamour and wealth. They don't get told unless people like you choose to listen. If you're comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what drew you to Cold Trail today. Your engagement, your attention, your willingness to bear witness, that's what helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light. Now, let me tell you what happened to Willow Hayes. The press conference happened with shocking speed. Less than 48 hours after Willow failed to appear for her Saturday meeting, Sterling Models' public relations team had assembled a crowd of journalists in the agency's ground floor gallery space. Camera crews from 3 local television stations set up their equipment. Print journalists from the Miami Herald and various fashion trades took their seats. The speed suggested preparation, as if the entire event had been planned in advance. Mr. Arthur Sterling appeared at exactly 10 a.m., dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, his expression carefully calibrated between disappointment and concern. He stood before a backdrop featuring the Sterling Models logo, flanked by 2 attorneys and the agency's head of public relations. No police were present. Walter Jenkins watched from the back of the room, ostensibly there to ensure the space was properly maintained, but really because something about the entire situation felt wrong. He'd spent Sunday trying to convince himself that Willow had simply run away, that she'd finally had enough of Sterling's control and vanished into whatever life she'd left behind in Georgia. But the speed of this press conference, the carefully orchestrated nature of it, the way Sterling's attorneys kept their hands on thick folders of prepared documents, it all felt rehearsed. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Sterling began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "It's with deep regret and profound disappointment that I must address the disappearance of Miss Willow Hayes, one of Sterling Models' most promising young talents." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. On Saturday morning, September 12th, Willow was scheduled to attend a critically important meeting that would have launched her international career. She never arrived. Subsequent investigation has revealed that Willow used forged travel documents to leave the United States. Destination unknown, approximately 48 hours prior to her scheduled obligation. A murmur rippled through the assembled journalists. Sterling raised his hand for quiet. I want to be clear about what happened here, because I believe it's important for young people to understand the consequences of poor decisions. Willow Hayes came to us from a difficult background, broken family, limited education, a history of seeking meaning in unconventional places. We provided her with an extraordinary opportunity, not just for wealth and fame, but for stability and purpose. And she threw it away. Sterling's voice hardened slightly, the disappointment shading into something colder. We've learned through our investigation that Willow had been in communication with a religious organization, a wealthy commune based internationally that practices extreme isolation from mainstream society. They forbid members from maintaining contact with their previous lives, from participating in what they term industries of vanity. Modeling, by their doctrine, is explicitly forbidden. He produced a folder, held it up for the cameras. These are copies of email communications between Willow and representatives of this organization, expressing her desire to reject material success in favor of spiritual enlightenment. We've also obtained evidence of the forged passport and travel documents she used to leave the country. I've provided copies of all this material to the authorities, though they've indicated that because Willow is legally emancipated and over 17, and because she left voluntarily, there's little they can do to compel her return. Walter felt his stomach turn. The story was too complete, too perfect. Every question anticipated and answered, every loose end tied up. One journalist raised her hand. Mr. Sterling, have you had any direct contact with Willow since she disappeared? No. The nature of this organization is that they immediately sever all contact with the outside world. We've attempted to reach her through multiple channels, but without success. Sterling's expression softened slightly, the calculated empathy of a man who'd practiced this moment. I want to be clear. I don't hate Willow Hayes. I'm disappointed in her choices, yes. But I also understand that young people sometimes make decisions based on emotion rather than reason. My door remains open should she choose to return. Do you know which country she traveled to? The investigation is ongoing, but we believe she's somewhere in Central or South America. The organization maintains several compounds in that region. Can you name the organization? For legal reasons, I cannot. But I've provided all relevant information to the appropriate authorities. The questions continued for another 20 minutes. Sterling's answers were consistent, measured, designed to paint Willow as a troubled young woman who'd made a regrettable choice. By the end of the conference, the narrative was set. Willow Hayes, ungrateful and misguided, had abandoned her dreams for a cult. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. By Tuesday morning, Willow's story was on the front page of the Herald Style section. Model trades runway for religious retreat, read one headline. Sterling star vanishes into cult, declared another. Fashion industry blogs picked up the story, turning it into a cautionary tale about the pressures of modeling and the dangers of extreme spiritual movements. Walter read every article, watched every news segment, and with each repetition of Sterling's narrative, his unease grew. Something was profoundly wrong. But what could he do? He was a janitor, an old man with no proof, no evidence, just a feeling in his gut that Willow Hayes hadn't left voluntarily. He tried once, on Wednesday morning, to speak with the police. He went to the Brickell substation, waited for 2 hours, finally got an audience with a detective named Morrison, who listened to Walter's concerns with barely concealed impatience. Let me understand, Mr. Jenkins. You're reporting that you have a feeling something's wrong. I'm saying the story doesn't make sense. Willow was scared of Mr. Sterling, but she wasn't the type to run away. And this whole cult thing, it's too convenient. Mr. Sterling provided extensive documentation to support his statement. Emails, travel records, witness statements from other agency staff about her interest in spiritual matters. The young woman is legally an adult. She left voluntarily. There's no crime here. But what if, Mr. Jenkins, with respect, you're a janitor? You're not in a position to know what was really going on in this young woman's head. Mr. Sterling is a respected businessman who's been operating in this community for decades. If he says she joined a religious organization, I'm inclined to believe him. Detective Morrison stood, signaling the conversation was over. If she contacts you, let us know. Otherwise, there's nothing to investigate. Walter left the police station feeling hollowed out. He'd tried. He'd done what he could. But he was exactly what Detective Morrison said. Just a janitor. Invisible. Powerless. He returned to work that afternoon, moving through the agency's halls like a ghost, and tried to tell himself he'd done everything possible. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early October, Mr. Arthur Sterling gathered his senior staff in the penthouse gallery for an announcement. Walter was present, as he always was for agency events, standing in the back corner, ready to clean up whatever mess was made. Sterling stood before a large object draped in black silk. "I want to thank you all for your support during this difficult time," Sterling began, his voice solemn. "The loss of Willow Hayes has been painful for all of us, a reminder of how fragile dreams can be, how easily talent can be wasted. But I've come to believe that we have an obligation to preserve what was best about Willow, to remember the potential she possessed before she threw it away." He reached for the silk drape. "I commissioned this piece from one of Europe's finest artistic craftsmen, a master of hyper-realistic sculpture. It's my tribute to Willow Hayes, not as she became, but as she could have been. A reminder that beauty, when properly preserved, can transcend the corruption of poor choices." Sterling pulled away the silk. The room fell silent. Standing before them, impossibly perfect, was Willow Hayes. Not a photograph, not a painting, but a three-dimensional figure so realistic that several people in the room audibly gasped. The figure wore a black evening gown, identical to one Willow had worn in a test shoot the week before she vanished. The face was exactly her face, down to the small freckle above her left eyebrow, the slight asymmetry of her lips. The hair was real, human hair, styled in the elegant updo Sterling had favored. The eyes, made from hand-painted glass, seemed to look directly at the viewer with an expression of serene melancholy. The figure stood on a polished wooden base, positioned as if mid-stride on a runway, one arm slightly extended, the posture perfect. "My God," someone whispered. Sterling smiled, pleased with the reaction. "Remarkable, isn't it? True artistry. This piece will remain in my private atelier as a reminder of what we lost, and what we must always strive to protect. The purity of beauty, before it becomes corrupted by the world." The staff filed past the figure, marveling at its realism. Several people reached out to touch it before Sterling sharply ordered them not to. "The oils from human hands can degrade the surface material," he explained. "No one touches her but me." Walter stood at the back of the room, staring at the figure, and felt something cold and terrible settle into his bones. The weight of it. The absolute realism. The way the skin seemed to have pores. The way the fingers had actual fingerprints visible in the sculpted material. This wasn't a sculpture. Couldn't be. No artist, no matter how skilled, could achieve this level of perfection. But that was impossible. That was insane. That was the kind of thought a paranoid old man would have. The kind of thought that got you dismissed as crazy or senile. Walter said nothing. After the unveiling, Sterling had the figure moved to his private atelier, the climate-controlled room on the penthouse level. The room was immediately locked, and Sterling kept the only key, except for one copy, which he gave to Walter. "You'll clean the atelier every Tuesday morning," Sterling instructed. "Use only the approved cleaning solutions I've provided. Never touch the figure directly. Dust around it. Maintain the space. But do not attempt to move or examine it. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good. This is a great responsibility, Walter. You're the only person I trust with access to this space." Walter took the key, its weight somehow heavier than it should have been. And so began the ritual that would define the next 25 years of Walter Jenkins' life. Every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., before the agency opened, before anyone else arrived, Walter would unlock the atelier and clean around the figure that wore Willow Hayes's face. The room had a strange smell, chemically sweet, like formaldehyde mixed with something else Walter couldn't identify. Sterling claimed it was from the preservation materials he used for the vintage leather displays also kept in the room. Walter wanted to believe that. The figure stood in the center of the space, always in the same position, illuminated by carefully positioned track lighting. Week after week, year after year, Walter would dust the shelves, clean the floors, avoid looking at those glass eyes that seemed to follow his movement. He never touched the figure, never examined it closely, never voiced his suspicions, even to himself, because to acknowledge what he suspected, to actually examine the evidence and confirm the impossible truth, would mean Walter Jenkins had spent decades as an accomplice to something monstrous. Would mean he'd cleaned the tomb where Willow Hayes had been kept as Sterling's perfect, silent masterpiece. So Walter said nothing, did his job, kept the secret he pretended not to know. And in the climate-controlled darkness of that locked room, the figure stood waiting, year after year, for someone to finally see the truth hidden in plain sight. 25 years. That's how long the lie lasted. 25 years of silence, before a janitor's failing grip and a butterfly tattoo ripped open the carefully constructed fiction and exposed the horror that Arthur Sterling had called art. But that moment was still far in the future. For now, in October 1998, the story was settled. Willow Hayes had run away to join a cult. The mannequin in Sterling's atelier was just a tribute, a memorial to wasted potential. And Walter Jenkins, invisible as always, kept cleaning. Time moves differently when you're carrying a secret you refuse to name. For Walter Jenkins, the years between 1998 and 2023 became a blur of Tuesday mornings, each one identical to the last. 6 a.m., unlock the atelier, step into that chemical sweetness, clean around the figure without looking at it directly, lock the door, pretend everything is normal, but the weight never changed. Every time Walter had to move the figure slightly to clean beneath its base, he felt it. Too heavy. Far too heavy for any sculpture, no matter how realistic. The first time, in 1999, he'd nearly dropped it, shocked by the density. After that, he learned to brace himself, to use both hands, to treat it like moving a body rather than a statue. He never asked himself why that metaphor came so naturally. The smell persisted too, that sweet chemical tang that clung to his uniform after every cleaning session. Sterling's explanation about preservation materials for leather displays satisfied everyone else. But Walter knew that room. He'd cleaned every inch of it for decades. There were no leather displays worth that level of preservation. Only the figure. Only her. Outside that locked room, Willow Hayes became mythology. The model who chose a cult over fame. Sterling told the story often at industry events, always with the same tone of paternal disappointment, always ending with a reminder about the dangers of spiritual extremism and ungrateful youth. New models arriving at the agency would hear the cautionary tale during orientation. Willow's name became shorthand for wasted potential, for the importance of loyalty, for what happened when you rejected Sterling's guidance. Walter listened to these retellings in silence, pushing his cleaning cart through hallways filled with people who had no idea what stood in that locked room. Who would believe a janitor? What evidence did he have beyond a feeling? A weight. A smell. Sterling had documentation, police reports, witness statements. Walter had nothing but suspicion and cowardice. He told himself he was being paranoid. That grief and age were making him see patterns that didn't exist. That successful men like Arthur Sterling didn't commit atrocities and display them as art. He told himself these lies every Tuesday for 25 years. But in 2019, someone arrived who refused to accept the official story. Jasmine Hayes was 25 years old when she first appeared at Sterling Model's reception desk, asking to speak with anyone who remembered her sister. She had Willow's bone structure, the same defiance set to her jaw. But where Willow had been quiet fire, Jasmine burned visible and bright. Walter was emptying trash near the reception area when he overheard the receptionist firmly explaining that Mr. Sterling didn't grant interviews about past models, that the Willow Hayes matter was closed, that there was nothing to discuss. Jasmine's voice cut through the corporate politeness like a blade. My sister didn't join a cult. She would never abandon her family. Someone here knows what really happened. The receptionist picked up the phone, security already on speed dial. Walter watched Jasmine leave, escorted out by 2 guards, her shoulders rigid with rage. Something in her certainty shook loose a piece of the wall Walter had built around his suspicions. Over the next 4 years, Jasmine became a persistent presence on the agency's periphery. She hired private investigators with money she'd saved, working double shifts as a nurse. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She tracked down former Sterling Models employees, asking the questions no one wanted to answer. She built a website cataloging inconsistencies in Sterling's story, analyzing the timeline, questioning the convenient perfection of his documentation. Most people dismissed her as a grieving sister unable to accept reality. But Walter, watching her from his invisible position, recognized the truth in her obsession. She knew, maybe not the specific horror, but she knew her sister hadn't left voluntarily. By early 2023, Jasmine's focus had sharpened. Sterling Models was failing. The industry had changed. And Sterling, now 88, hadn't changed with it. Bookings were down. Major clients had departed. Rumors of liquidation circulated through Miami's fashion community. Walter saw Jasmine twice that spring, sitting in her car across from the agency's entrance, watching, waiting. She'd spent years chasing shadows, but now the building itself was about to give up its secrets. Everything inside would have to be cataloged, sold, disposed of, including whatever was in that locked atelier. Then, on a humid morning in June 2023, Arthur Sterling collapsed in his penthouse office. Massive heart attack, dead before the paramedics arrived. Walter got the news from Sterling's executive assistant, who seemed more concerned about her severance package than her employer's death. The agency would close. Everything would be liquidated. Walter, as the longest-serving employee, was being kept on through the closure process to help with the clearance, which meant Walter Jenkins, at 80 years old, was finally going to have to open that room and confront what he'd spent a quarter-century pretending not to know. The liquidators gave Walter 3 weeks to clear the penthouse level. They wanted the valuable items cataloged, the trash removed, everything ready for the estate sale that would strip Sterling Models down to its bones. Walter moved through the familiar spaces slowly, his aging body protesting the work, his mind racing ahead to the room he'd been avoiding, the atelier. The last space on his list. He stood outside its door on a Tuesday morning, because some rituals die hard, holding the key Sterling had given him 25 years ago. His hand shook as he fitted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked open with the same sound it had made thousands of times before, but today it felt final. Irreversible. The chemical smell hit him first, stronger than usual, as if Sterling's death had broken whatever ventilation system had been managing it. The room looked exactly as it always had. Track lighting illuminating the center of the space. Shelves along the walls holding Sterling's collection of fashion memorabilia. And in the middle, frozen in mid-stride, wearing that black evening gown, the figure that Walter had cleaned around for 9,000 Tuesdays. The liquidators wanted everything out, which meant Walter would have to move it, really move it, not just shift it slightly for cleaning. He'd have to lift it, carry it, load it onto a cart for transport to whatever storage facility was handling Sterling's personal effects. Walter approached slowly, as if the figure might suddenly move. Up close, the realism was even more disturbing. The glass eyes caught the light at angles that made them seem wet, alive. The skin texture showed pores, tiny imperfections, the kind of details no sculptor could fake. The hair, real human hair, had collected 25 years of dust despite Walter's careful maintenance. He positioned himself behind the figure, gripping it under the arms the way he'd learned to do for those slight repositioning movements. He lifted, his back protesting immediately. God, the weight, the impossible, undeniable weight of human density preserved in chemical stasis. Walter's foot caught on the base. He stumbled backward, losing his grip. The figure pitched forward, and for a horrifying moment Walter thought it would shatter on the concrete floor, releasing whatever Sterling had done to it. It didn't shatter. It hit hard, with a sound like meat slapping stone, and rolled slightly onto its side. And the small black hair clip, perfectly positioned for 25 years to hold the elegant updo in place, came loose. It skittered across the floor, and the carefully arranged hair fell free. Walter stood there, breathing hard, staring at what the hair had hidden. The back of the head, the visible scalp showing through where the hair parted. Real scalp, real skin, actual human tissue preserved in whatever monstrous process Sterling had perfected. And there, just visible at the neckline where the dress had shifted during the fall, Walter saw something else, a small mark, dark against the preserved skin. His legs moved before his mind caught up. He knelt beside the figure, hands shaking violently now, and carefully, so carefully, pulled the dress fabric down just enough to see the small of the back. There it was, faded but unmistakable. A butterfly tattoo, small, delicate, exactly where Willow Hayes had told him she would place it. The tattoo she'd been planning to get that final Saturday. The tattoo Sterling had forbidden, which meant she'd gotten it anyway. Before she disappeared, before Sterling unveiled his tribute, Walter's vision blurred. 25 years of denial shattered in an instant. This wasn't a sculpture, wasn't a mannequin, wasn't art. This was Willow Hayes. The actual Willow Hayes. Her body preserved through some technique Walter couldn't begin to understand, turned into Sterling's personal monument to control and possession. Walter Jenkins, 80 years old, janitor for 50 years, invisible for his entire adult life, finally saw what he'd been looking at every Tuesday morning for a quarter century. He'd been cleaning a tomb. He'd been maintaining a crime scene. He'd been complicit in hiding a murder displayed as art. Walter scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until his back hit the wall. The figure lay there on the concrete, hair spread around it like a dark halo. That butterfly tattoo visible proof of the horror Sterling had committed. And Walter, who had said nothing for 25 years, who had cleaned and maintained and pretended not to know, finally understood that silence had its own terrible weight. His phone was in his pocket. The police were a call away, but Walter's hands were shaking too badly to dial. Instead, he did what he should have done in 1998. He ran. Walter's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd locked the atelier door behind him, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had fled, and then he'd walked. Down 3 flights of stairs because the elevator felt too enclosed, too slow. Out through the service entrance because facing the main lobby seemed impossible. Into the Miami heat that did nothing to warm the ice in his veins. He needed to call the police. Should have called them immediately. But the thought of standing in that room, explaining what he'd found while that thing lay on the floor behind him, had sent him running like a coward. Again. Always running. Always silent when silence was easier than truth. The community library on Brickell Avenue had been Walter's refuge for years. A quiet place where an old janitor could read newspapers and pretend he was the kind of person who had opinions about world events rather than secrets that corroded his soul. He pushed through the glass doors into the air-conditioned silence, headed for the back corner, where the payphones still stood like relics. And that's when he saw her. Jasmine Hayes sat at a research computer, surrounded by printed documents and handwritten notes. Her eyes had the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been awake for days. On the screen in front of her, architectural plans. Sterling models his building layout. Floor by floor. She'd been planning this, waiting for Sterling to die, for the building to open up, for her chance to finally search the spaces that had been locked to her for years. Walter's legs carried him toward her before his brain could stop him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was 25 years of carrying weight he was never meant to bear alone. Maybe it was that she was Willow's blood. and Willow deserved better than Walter's cowardice. Miss Hayes. She looked up, startled, then defensive. Her hand moved to her phone like she expected security. I have every right to be here. This is a public library. I know what happened to your sister. The words hung in the air between them. Jasmine's face went through a series of emotions too fast to track. Disbelief, hope, rage, fear. What did you say? Walter's hand was in his pocket, fingers wrapped around something he'd grabbed without thinking when the figure fell. Something small and hard that had been lodged in the base, dislodged by impact. He pulled it out, placed it on the table between them. A micro-cassette recorder. Antique, the kind used in the 80s and 90s. The kind Sterling had used before everything went digital. I found this inside. I think he wanted someone to know. Eventually, Jasmine stared at the recorder like it might explode. Inside what? The figure. The mannequin in Sterling's private room. It's not a mannequin, Miss Hayes. It's your sister. It's Willow. He watched her face crumble and reform, watched her try to process words that shouldn't make sense but somehow did. She'd known. Some part of her had always known. Show me. We need to listen first. Please. Jasmine's laptop had a USB cassette converter, the kind researchers used for digitizing old interviews. Her hands were steadier than Walter's as she set it up, connected the ancient recorder to modern technology, pressed play. Static first. Then Sterling's voice, younger than Walter remembered, recorded sometime in the late 90s, based on the references. Remarkable, really. The polymer resin technique, properly applied, creates a permanent stasis. She'll never age, never decay, never change. Perfection. Frozen in the moment of its highest expression. The process required precision, of course. The timing had to be exact. Too soon and the preservation fails. Too late and deterioration begins. But I've always had excellent timing. Jasmine made a sound like she'd been punched. Sterling's voice continued, pride evident in every word. The cult story was elegantly simple. I'd been documenting her spiritual interests for months, manufacturing evidence, creating a paper trail. The forged passport was expensive but worth every penny. By the time anyone thought to question the narrative, she'd already been transformed, already become what she was always meant to be. Mine. Completely. Eternally. The recording continued for another 10 minutes. Sterling detailing his process with the clinical precision of an artist explaining technique. How he'd lured Willow to the atelier that Saturday morning. How the initial sedation had been followed by the careful application of preservative compounds. How he'd positioned her exactly, dressed her perfectly, spent weeks perfecting the surface treatments that would make her appear artificial enough to hide in plain sight. The genius is that people see what they expect to see. Tell them it's art, and they'll admire the craftsmanship. Tell them it's a tribute, and they'll applaud the sentiment. Nobody questions. Nobody looks closely, because powerful men are presumed innocent, and dead girls are presumed to have brought it on themselves somehow. The recording ended with Sterling's soft laugh, pleased with his own cleverness. Jasmine sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her mouth. Walter felt something break loose in his chest, some wall he'd maintained for decades finally crumbling. I should have known, he whispered. I should have said something. 25 years. You're saying something now. Jasmine's voice was raw but steady. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and Walter saw Willow's defiance burning in her sister's face. We're saying something now. Together. She grabbed her phone. We're calling the police. And this time, they're going to listen. Detective Morrison was retired, but the officer who took their call, Detective Sarah Chen, listened with the kind of focused intensity Walter had wished for 25 years ago. The microcassette helped. Sterling's voice, recorded in his own words, confessing to murder and describing his preservation technique, was evidence that couldn't be dismissed as an old janitor's paranoia. or a grieving sister's obsession. Chen arrived at the library within 30 minutes, bringing a forensic team and a warrant she'd somehow obtained in record time. Walter led them to the atelier, his key turning in that lock one final time, and stepped back as professionals took over the space he'd cleaned in silence for so long. The figure lay where Walter had left it, hair spread across concrete, butterfly tattoo visible. The forensic photographer documented everything before anyone touched it. Then came the careful examination, the horrified confirmations whispered between experts who'd thought they'd seen everything. Actual human tissue, preserved through some kind of polymer infusion. Tattoo ink still visible in the dermal layers. Dental records will confirm, but the structural analysis suggests. Jasmine stood beside Walter in the hallway, barred from the crime scene but unable to leave. They watched through the open door as Sterling's masterpiece was finally recognized for what it truly was. Not art, not tribute. Murder, displayed as beauty. She got the tattoo, Jasmine said quietly. She did it anyway. Even knowing Sterling would be furious, she claimed that piece of herself. She showed it to me, Walter admitted. Told me what it meant. For your mother. Our mother. Different fathers, but Mom loved us both. Jasmine's voice cracked. Willow was supposed to come home that Christmas. She'd saved enough for plane tickets. She was going to surprise me. I was 8 years old, and I waited at the airport for 3 hours before Dad told me she wasn't coming. That she'd chosen something else instead. The guilt Walter had been carrying found company in Jasmine's grief. Two people, both carrying pieces of Willow's absence, both victims of Sterling's perfect lie. The forensic team worked through the night. By morning, they'd confirmed what the microcassette had already revealed. The figure was Willow Hayes, her body preserved through an experimental polymer resin technique that had essentially plastinated her remains. Dental records matched. The butterfly tattoo matched descriptions Jasmine provided. Even the dress was original, the same one Willow had worn for test shoots that final week. Sterling had killed her in that room, likely through sedation followed by the preservation process itself. He'd kept her there for 25 years, cleaning her weekly through his proxy, maintaining his creation while the world forgot about the girl who'd supposedly joined a cult. The news coverage was immediate and extensive. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, beauty, murder, decades of deception. Sterling models became a crime scene. The fashion industry had to reckon with how one of its most respected figures had hidden a corpse as art for a quarter century and nobody had questioned it. But for Jasmine, the media circus was secondary to a quieter resolution. She sat in Detective Chen's office 3 days after the discovery, holding a folder containing the official findings, and finally heard word she'd been chasing for 15 years. Your sister didn't abandon you, Miss Hayes. She was murdered. And Arthur Sterling spent 25 years displaying his crime as if it were something to be proud of. Jasmine nodded, unable to speak, tears flowing freely now. Relief and grief mixing into something too complex for words. Willow hadn't chosen a cult over family, hadn't thrown away her dreams, hadn't stopped loving her little sister. She'd been stolen, murdered, erased. Can I see her? Jasmine finally asked. Before the funeral. Chen's expression softened. The remains are with the medical examiner, but I'll arrange it. You deserve to say goodbye properly. Walter watched this exchange from the hallway, no longer invisible but not quite sure what his new visibility meant. He'd given his statement, handed over the micro-cassette, confirmed 25 years of weekly cleaning. He'd expected judgment, condemnation for his silence. Instead, Chen had called him a key witness. The media called him the hero who'd finally exposed the truth. But Walter knew better. Heroes didn't wait 25 years. Heroes didn't clean around corpses pretending they were sculptures. Heroes spoke up when speaking up might have mattered. Still, when Jasmine found him in that hallway, she took his weathered hands in hers. Thank you, she said simply, for remembering, for holding on to that detail about the tattoo. I should have told someone sooner. You told someone when it mattered. When there was finally proof. When people would listen. She squeezed his hands. That's enough. The funeral happened on a clear November morning, 25 years and 2 months after Willow Hayes disappeared. Jasmine buried her sister properly this time, in a cemetery outside Atlanta near their mother's grave, with a headstone that told the truth. Beloved daughter and sister, stolen too soon. The fashion industry held its own reckoning. Sterling Models closed permanently. Its reputation destroyed beyond redemption. Other agencies scrambled to distance themselves from Sterling's legacy, instituting new oversight procedures, ethics committees, protections for young models. Whether these changes would last, or were merely performative theater, remained to be seen. Walter attended the funeral at Jasmine's invitation, standing quietly in the back as Willow was finally laid to rest. He thought about all the Tuesday mornings, all the times he'd cleaned around her without acknowledging what he knew. The weight of those silences would never fully lift, but speaking the truth had at least made it bearable. After the service, as people scattered to their cars, Jasmine found Walter one last time. What will you do now? Retire, I think. Actually retire. I've cleaned enough rooms for one lifetime. She smiled, sad but genuine. You gave my sister back to me, Walter. Gave me the truth I'd been chasing for years. That matters more than you know. They parted there, two people bound by shared witness to Sterling's crime, each carrying pieces of Willow forward into whatever came next. The story made headlines for weeks, then months, then eventually faded as stories do, replaced by newer horrors, fresher scandals. But for those who knew Willow Hayes, who'd loved her, or worked beside her, or simply remembered her face on test prints that never became campaigns, the truth changed everything. Beauty, they learned, could be weaponized. Control could masquerade as mentorship. Power could hide atrocities right in front of people who chose not to see. And silence, even well-intentioned silence, even frightened silence, had consequences that echoed across decades. Walter Jenkins, in his small apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay, thought about these things often in the months after. He thought about visibility and invisibility, about how the powerful relied on invisible people staying silent, about how that silence protected monsters better than any locked door. And he thought about Willow Hayes, 17 years old, defiant enough to get a forbidden tattoo, brave enough to claim one small piece of herself in Sterling's kingdom of control. That butterfly tattoo had been her final act of resistance, the detail that eventually exposed Sterling's perfect lie. For 25 years, Mr. Arthur Sterling kept his masterpiece locked away, believing he had sculpted the perfect silence. But he forgot that even a janitor, an invisible man, is a witness, and the truth, eventually, always finds a way to move. This is Cold Trail. If this story moved you, if Willow's truth matters to you, then don't just listen and leave. Hit that subscribe button right now. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell us what stories we should work on next. These cases, these voices silenced by power and money and calculated lies, they only get heard because you refuse to let them stay buried. So don't be passive, don't be silent, be part of bringing these cold trails back to life. Subscribe, share, speak up, because the next Willow Hayes might be waiting for someone to finally listen.